It's a great privilege to introduce Professor Alister McGrath, who is Professor of Historical Theology at Oxford. He's also President of the Oxford Centre for Evangelism and Apologetics. He started life as a scientist, reading chemistry at Oxford, doing research for a doctorate in chemistry, and then he switched to theology. He's had an absolutely massive, prolific output as a theologian in all sorts of areas, from Reformation theology to modern theology, to German Christology. I mean, you name it. Alister, I think, has written about it. And I had the very great privilege of being taught by him when he was principal of Wycliffe Hall. In more recent years, he has turned to the study of science and religion, and in particular has worked on this scientific theology. He's produced this brilliant trilogy, and we've got on the bookstall what is a summary of that trilogy. And he's still working in that area, and there's another book called The Order of Things, and there's more to come, I think, which maybe you'll tell us about. So we're very excited to have your talk now on scientific theology.
Well, thank you very much, and again it's very good to be with you this afternoon and talk about this theme. And what I want to do is to just try and introduce the ideas I developed in these books. I'm not saying they're right, I'm simply saying they might be worth exploring further, and trying to give you an idea of what they are and where they might take us. And what I just want to do is begin by clearing the ground a little bit. And what I hope to do here is to just try and talk about some of the characteristics of this approach. It really is it's a very Christian approach. I mean, it is saying, look, this is trying to engage with Christianity in particular, not so much religion, but much more Christianity in particular. And also, it argues for the need for a direct engagement between Christian theology and the natural sciences, rather than a mediated dialogue. Now, those of you who've been studying the science religion dialogue will know that for many people it's very helpful to have a kind of conversation partner, for example, like process thought. And my personal view is A, process thought actually isn't all that helpful, B, actually we don't really need in dialogue partners at all. We can talk to each other without the need for these kind of intermediaries. And I use the model here. The Latin term is Ancilia Theologiae. The Latin term literally means a handmaid of theology, but really it means a kind of dialogue partner. And the point is that if you look at Christian theology down the ages, this has been a regular feature of the way in which Christians think about their faith and do theology. They kind of lean upon, they borrow ideas from dialogue partners. And basically it's a very important way of, in the first place, stimulating theological development, but in the second place, of actually being able to interact with a particular group. Just to give you some examples, in the early patristic period, we're talking here about the 2nd century, Justin Martyr was a very significant figure. Argued that Platonism served two roles. Number one, it helped Christians to do theology, but number two, it was like a conduit by which Christianity could be mediated to the Platonic community. So it's about increased intellectual rigor in theology, but also about increasing possibilities of communication with audiences that otherwise might be inaccessible. Or again, to give you one very obvious example, in the 13th century, the kind of Aristotelianism you find in Thomas Aquinas, again, was seen as being very significant. And for Aquinas, Aristotle gave you a way of ordering your theology more rigorously, but also of engaging in dialogue with Aristotelian philosophers, who were rather significant in the area of Paris at that time. Or we could go on like this. For example, in the 19th century, many found Hegel to be a very interesting dialogue partner, and in the 20th century, many writers have found existentialism to be, again, another significant partner. So the simple point I want to try and make is that Christian theology has always said, look, it's helpful to talk to other people in shaping our ideas, but also in communicating them. And therefore, the key point I want to make is that this is a well-established approach whose possibilities and liabilities are well known. The good points, if you like, are that it brings increased rigor and allows you to communicate with other groups. The drawback, the danger, is that actually you import ideas from outside Christianity that actually kind of mess things up. For example, Aristotle did not believe in a creator God. Thomas Aquinas has to kind of just modify Aristotle at that point. And really my argument is that a very significant dialogue partner today is the natural sciences. But I need to pause at this point and make one very obvious comment. Science is a changing discipline. And therefore, the views, for example, that were characteristic of the natural sciences in the 16th century would not be characteristic in the 21st. For example, we don't believe in, to give you some outmoded ideas, phlogiston or caloric, even though those were helpful ideas at the time. Science changes. It's provisional. It's progressive. And this means that if you anchor theology to science at any one moment, it's going to be rendered obsolete in 10, 20, 30 years' time. And so my argument, therefore, is not to anchor theology to any specific way of thinking about science, but rather to anchor it to the general methods and assumptions that underlie the science, even though these methods and assumptions may lead to different theories in different ages. It's the underlying principles that really matter. I also argue that the dialogue between theology and natural science is not opportunistic or arbitrary. In other words, not just saying, oh, what should we do today? I know. Let's have a dialogue between theology and science, and tomorrow we'll have a dialogue between theology and advanced network. I mean, it's much more than that. It's this deep feeling that there is actually something very fundamental there. Namely that the Christian way of understanding nature, the Christian doctrine of creation, actually gives us a moral imperative to try and establish this kind of connection. In other words, nature is God's creation, and therefore one way of looking at God's creation, the sciences, might be helpful in another way of looking at it. So maybe when they share their ideas, there could be mutual enrichment. And that seems to me to be an extremely important and useful line of thought. In other words, you affirm a unitary vision of reality and say, look, we can try and make more sense of it by trying to work together. So in the 3 volumes of this book, which as you can see is loosely called as Scientific Theology, I try to look at a whole range of issues. Now in the space I have this afternoon, I have not got time to talk about everything, so I'm simply going to focus down on some things I hope you'll find interesting. I hope also you'll find accessible. And obviously there's a lot more I could talk about, but I'm going to just limit myself. In the first volume, I ask a very simple, a deceptively simple, but I have to say very difficult question, which is, what is nature? We use the term regularly. We talk about nature as if it was self-evident that there is a thing called nature, and everybody knows exactly what it is. I mean, for example, it might be trees, mountains, oceans, and wildlife. But actually, there is a real issue here. Robert Boyle has a rather nice little way of speaking here. Nature, he writes, is the aggregate of bodies that make up the world. But you notice he's using the word nature to actually mean something that somehow stands over and embraces all these things. In other words, nature is not simply trees, mountains, oceans, wildlife. It is something that is these, but is more than these. But the real difficulty is when you start trying to work out what this is, it proves extremely difficult to reify, in other words, to conceptualize what nature actually is. Now, this is not an arbitrary question. I mean, certainly in many quarters today, the word natural has very deep resonances. Natural is good, as opposed to artificial. Think of food, for example. But the real difficulty is that nature actually proves much more elusive than you might think. And the real question I ask in this book is there some objective concept of nature that everybody can recognize and accept? And the answer I have to give is no, that actually everybody has their own distinctive angle on this. And you can see this in a number of ways. One of these is by looking at the images that have been used in philosophy and science and even theology down the ages. For example, nature as a theatre in which a great drama of life is played out. Nature as a mirror reflects the way things are. Philosophy then is seen as a mirror of nature. The image of nature as a book, an extremely influential image in the late Renaissance. God has written 2 books, Scripture, but also the book of creation. And you can read each of these and find God in both of them. Or again, an image we associate more with the way of thinking that emerged after Newton. Nature as a giant machine. Think, for example, of William Paley's very famous image of the watch on the heath. Machines are all about design and construction. Isn't nature something that's been constructed? Or again, much more recently, James Lovelock is a very obvious example, nature as some kind of living organism. Now, each of these images might well be complementary to others, but they are also rather different. And the key point I want to make is each of them projects a different understanding of what nature is. Now, of course, we live, as we are endlessly reminded, in a postmodern era. I think people have different understandings of what that means, but certainly, if this is right, then there are a number of issues that we might raise. Postmodernity, for example, argues that there is no obviously right way of reading a text or interpreting nature, and argues that interpretations we offer are not intrinsic to nature itself, but are rather our creations that we have kind of laid on top of nature. And the process of deconstruction, a very significant phrase for postmodern writers, that means you can identify the agendas and the interests of those who interpret nature in this way. But certainly if we go back to that image of nature as a text, you can see it's a very helpful way of beginning to think about it. The idea communicates the idea of the public intelligibility of nature. And again, many of you will come across this quote from Galileo. Philosophy is written in this grand book, the universe, which stands continually open to our gaze. Very significant statement in terms of the line of thought it encouraged. In some way, we can take our cues from the natural order, that reading this book opens up others for us. And again, you'll find this image used, for example, in Protestantism. Here's the Belgic Confession, a very famous confession of faith that came out in the lowlands in 1560. Knowledge of God comes first by the creation, preservation, and government of the universe, which is, look at this language, before our eyes as a most beautiful book, in which all creatures, great and small, are like so many characters, leading us to contemplate the invisible things of God. So you can see there a very significant motivation for doing science. To do science is to read the book of God, and see how powerful that image might have been to many at the time. Or again, coming back to England in the 17th century, Thomas Browne's famous statement, there are 2 books in which I collect my divinity, the written one of God, in other words the Bible, but also his servant nature, that universal and public manuscript that lies expanse, he means laid out open, unto the eyes of all. Those that never saw him in the one have discovered him in the other. So this textual image of nature is very, very interesting. But here's the issue. You and I know very, very well that texts are interpreted in different ways. What is the right way of interpreting nature? And again, if a postmodern philosopher was here talking to you, he or she would probably make the following 3 points. Number 1, there is no objective reality outside the text that determines the shape of the text or how it's to be interpreted. And you all know Jacques Derrida's very famous slogan, there is nothing outside the text. Let's see if we can just retrieve that for you. No, not good. There we are. There is nothing by which the means of the text can be determined. In other words, it's open to whatever interpretation you please. And again, another point that Derrida and many others make is the identity and intentions of the author of the text have no relevance to its interpretation. And again, Barth's famous phrase, the death of the author. You interpret the text as you please. There's no requirement to read it in any particular way. And a third point, multiple reading of texts. You can interpret this in any way you like. Meanings are the creation of its readers, not the necessary outcome of the text itself. And the key point I'm simply making is that nature is open to multiple interpretations. During the early Enlightenment, you very often get the impression that people felt that nature had some distinct, independent identity which could be decisive in shaping our philosophy, our morality, and our theology. But actually, that dream just hasn't come true. There are so many ways of interpreting nature that we're actually left open to things. And the key point I make in this first volume is simply that as there is no universal objective way of seeing nature, then Christians must be free to see nature in their own distinctive way, and of course that means seeing it as God's creation. And again, the key point, we see things in certain ways. And Lord Hanson's very famous quote, we see things through theory-driven glasses, or the theory-laden nature of observation. We see things as something. There's always interpretation involved in the process of observation. And again, the importance of identifying that and working on it. And again, Christian theology sees nature as God's creation. So what I then do is just say, well, look, if this is what we do, where do we go from here? What sort of ideas begin to develop from it? And one of them, of course, is the idea of natural theology, and I'll come back to that presently. But of course, there's also this very significant point about the intelligibility of the world. Why are we able to make sense of things? Now again, I suspect John Polkinghorne may have been talking to you about this, but if you read Polkinghorne's books, one of the key points is why? Why is mathematics helpful in understanding the world when mathematics is meant to be the free creation of the human mind? Why does mathematics seem to represent the way things are? And again, a very important theological theme here is the idea of the imago Dei, the image of God. Let me just try and explain this. And what I will do, if I may, is quote from John Polkinghorne, because I think he's an extremely accessible writer. And in his book, One World, he writes as follows. We are so familiar with the fact that we can understand the world that most of the time we take it for granted. It is what makes science possible. Yet, and a very big yet, it could have been otherwise. The universe might have been a disorderly chaos rather than orderly cosmos, or it might have had a rationality which is inaccessible to us. And so he simply says, look, there's a congruence between our minds, the universe, between the rationality experienced within and the rationality observed without. Why? Well, one answer might be the kind of answer you find in sociobiology. Well, because we've had to evolve like that. Otherwise, we couldn't live in this world. There might be something in that, but my personal view is the time frame of evolution doesn't really match that particularly well. Polkinghorne gives an answer which is classic, and I will repeat that answer in this lecture. It's all to do with the Christian doctrine of creation being implicated at every level. And this is Augustine writing back about the year 410 in De Trinitate, and he writes like this. The image of the Creator is to be found in the rational or intellectual soul of humanity. The human soul cannot be anything other than intellectual. It's been created according to the image of God in order that it may use reason and intellect in order to apprehend and behold God. Now, I've given you a little snippet from Augustine. The bigger picture is this. The same God who made the world made us. And therefore, should we be surprised that there's some kind of resonance between the way we think and the way the world as God's creation actually is? Or again, if I were to focus on one theologian who's looked at this in some detail, Tom Torrance, he argues that basically God has made us with this capacity to be able to discern this ordering within creation. That's what makes science possible, he argues. That in effect, science presupposes something it cannot itself prove, which is given it through the Christian doctrine of creation. Then we come to the area of natural theology, which is an intriguing area, and one which I think needs to be resuscitated, because it has died a death in recent years, but I think it can be given a new lease of life. And the real issue here is this. In what way can nature reveal God? Now, I put the word reveal in inverted commas because, I mean, it's not as if nature puts its hand up and says, please, I'm telling you about God. Isn't it much more that we begin to interpret nature in certain ways that makes it open or conducive to revealing God? Take Psalm 19 verse 1. The heavens declare the glory of God. How does that happen? Is it by, this is something active being done to us? Or is it that we suddenly begin to realize something and start seeing something that has always been there, but we only see it for the very first time? Is this activity on our part discerning what is there? That's the key question I wanted to ask. And of course, it's an extremely old question, and one which I think can be seen to be linked clearly with the doctrine of creation. And again, there's Athanasius in the 4th century. He writes as in De Incarnatione, God knew the limitations of humanity, and though the grace of being made in the image of God was sufficient to give him knowledge of the Word, and through him of the Father, as a safeguard against the neglect of this grace, God also provided the works of creation as a means by which the Maker might be known. Humanity, he writes, could thus look up into the immensity of heaven, and by pondering the harmony of creation, come to know its ruler, the Word of the Father, whose sovereign providence makes the Father known to all. Now, what I want you to notice is that there's been a long-standing debate about natural theology. The kind of style of natural theology that became very influential, especially in England, I would say from the early 18th century onwards, basically says, look, intelligent people can look at nature and realize there is a God and learn something of God's nature, God's character by doing so. And again, if you look at the very famous Boyle lectures, and that sort of approach is very much represented in those. Everyone can look at nature and see it as God's creation. I'm not so sure about that. I think there's another way of doing natural theology, and it's this. It's to say, from within the perspective of the Christian revelation, we see nature as God's creation, and thus we expect nature in some way to disclose or reflect the way God is like. In other words, it's not that natural theology is done outside the Christian revelation and then leads us into it. It is that it's done from within the Christian revelation, and you then begin to realize this has apologetic importance. See, for example, Acts chapter 17. But of course, in the 20th century, there's been a formidable objection to natural theology. And this is the Barthian objection. Karl Barth, very famous Protestant theologian, who basically argued natural theology subverts divine revelation. Let me try and unpack his concern. For Barth, the most decisive thing anyone could say is God has revealed himself. He chooses to make himself known. But if God can be known through nature, then why does God need to make himself known at all? Why can't we just look at nature and have done with it? And Barth feels that any way of thinking that says God can be known through nature actually is making divine revelation completely unnecessary. And he therefore enters a very significant caveat against that. And indeed, Rodney Holder, who introduced me, is looking at that kind of approach in a project he's working on now. So it's a very significant objection. But one can begin to engage with this. For example, Thomas Torrance argues that natural theology can be relocated or reconceptualized, not as trying to prove God's existence, but rather trying to think through the implications of the existence and character of a God who is already known. In other words, since God is like this, we should expect this God to be reflected or imprinted on the way nature actually is. So there's a very interesting debate there, which I take forward. But I want to move on, if I may, to the second volume, which is, I think, more interesting. And this is entitled Reality. And in this volume, I try to set out why Christian theology needs to be realist and how the natural sciences help us to do this. And obviously, I need to begin to talk about what kinds of realism are at our disposal. And I develop in particular an emphasis on critical realism. And so clearly, I need to explain what this is and why it's so important. And in this volume, I present what is really the first theological application of the critical realism of a man called Roy Bhaskar, who is a very interesting British social scientist. I'm going to explain to you the kind of ideas he develops. I'm going to begin, though, by quoting from Tom Wright, Bishop of Durham, who is a New Testament scholar who's very much aware of the importance of critical realism and sets out a very helpful way of thinking about it. Critical realism, Wright says, is a way of describing the process of knowing which acknowledges two aspects, both of which are true. Number one, the reality of the thing known as something other than the knower. In other words, there is a screen here. And if I turn away from this so I don't see it, the screen is still there. Isn't it? So in other words, something really there, independent of my perception of it, while also acknowledging that the only access we have to this reality lies along the spiraling path of appropriate dialogue conversation about the knower and the thing known. Hence critical. In other words, it's saying, look, it's not simply about this screen passively imprinting itself on my mind. The process of knowing is active, in which I engage with this, I represent it in certain ways, I use constructs, I use images to try and grasp what this is and deepen my appreciation of it. So there is interaction between the thing I know and I as the one who know this. And a key feature of any form of critical realism is a recognition that we are observers of nature, that we are not just observers of nature, we actually are located within nature itself. How do we take account of the fact that we are observing nature, ourselves being part of it? And again, it's an intriguing philosophical question. And playfully, Ford Madox Brown reflects this in his picture, The Hayfield. Now you've got it in black and white. Here it is in colour. Now have a look at that. The picture did not do well on its appearance. People didn't like the moonlight, which they felt gave it a very, very bad hue. But why don't you look at that? Just look at that picture a few minutes. It's a very interesting picture, which Ford Madox Brown has clearly painted. But he's in the picture. The artist is in the picture. He's trying to make the point that the dilemma we face is we are trying to account for a reality which we observe, and we are part of what is being observed. It's a very difficult idea to get, but there's this intrinsic self-referentiality to the whole process of observation. Now, Bhaskar identifies that as being very significant, but he also makes another point, which I'm going to look at. Those are the books in which he makes these points, those who'd like to take these home with you. But the point he makes is this. We must distinguish, he argues, between different ways of understanding the reaction, the relationship between natural theology, natural science I mean, and other areas of discipline. And he sets these out as follows. First of all, there is naturalism. Now again, this is a very significant conversation that's probably been had elsewhere, but it's interesting to note how he identifies naturalism, which basically is about there being an essential unity of method between the natural and social science. In other words, the natural sciences establish a method which can be used for everything. Then he talks about reductionism, which says there is an actual identity of subject matter between the two disciplines. In other words, the sciences and the humanities are talking about the same thing. That means you have to reduce one to the other. And Bhaskar is very, very critical. He says the distinctive feature of the sciences is their willingness to take things as they are, rather than insist they be taken as something else. And then scientism, a very clumsy word, but one I think we need to use, which denies there are any significant differences in the methods appropriate to studying social and natural objects. And obviously this would have relevance, for example, for any discussion about someone like as Richard Dawkins. But the main things that Bhaskar is saying basically allows us to say there is a real parallel between Christian theology and the natural sciences at two levels. Number one, a scientific theology is not about the invention of God or the invention of things about God. It's much more a response to an existing reality whose existence is independent of the actuality or possibility of human observation. Very, very key point. Bhaskar is very, very clear that the process of observing any external reality is modulated by us as observers. We have to use intermediaries sometimes in dealing with very difficult things. Think, for example, of scientific models that are used to help represent extremely difficult things. Bhaskar is saying that's the way we work as people, and that applies to theology as well. And again, if I had time, I want to give you a lecture on the use of models in theology and the natural sciences. But secondly, and again it's an extremely important point, each intellectual discipline must adopt a methodology which is appropriate to and determined by the ontology of its specific object. In other words, what you are studying is going to determine the way in which you study it. When I was a chemist, again I'm going back many years now, but I mean the electron used to puzzle me. And the reason it used to puzzle me is as a chemist I thought about electrons in a completely different way to my friends who were physicists. For me, electrons were simply things that got transferred, and that was all that mattered. But for my physicist friends, there was so much more to electrons than that. But at my level of explanation, that was all I needed. And again, it's extremely important to realize that in the sciences, there is a different level, a different way of engaging, which is shaped by what you are investigating. Physics, chemistry, and biology, they're all investigating nature, but the way they investigate is adapted to the specific aspect of that nature that's being investigated. And very importantly, this methodology is not determined in advance. As if you say, I know we're going to do it this way. It's determined by the engagement itself. It's a posteriori, not a priori. And Bhaskar goes on to develop this very interesting idea of the stratification of reality. He says we shouldn't talk about different sciences offering different perspectives on nature. Rather, we should think about reality as being multi-leveled, having different strata. In other words, there are different levels here, and each science investigates a different level. And this has an extremely important implication, which is that reductionism is about either refusing to realize there are different levels or trying to reduce them all to one single level. And each distinct stratum of reality demands its own mode of engagement to be determined not in advance, but actually through the outcome of that engagement. That's very hard to understand, so I'm going to give you an illustration. And this is all about the International Classification of Diseases and Handicaps model of illness. Here's my question to you. How would you define illness? How would you define illness? The problem is that illness is actually a big idea, a very big idea, with a number of different levels. And we might begin at one level. We might say, well, clearly there is a pathological element. There's something physically wrong with you. And as a result, that leads to a modification or reduction in something you do that affects behavior. And that in turn affects what you can do. And that in turn affects your social role because it's changed. And the point is that the word illness actually embraces all of those. Now, I mean, just to give you a simple example, I want to imagine that we're looking at something very specific. I mean, for example, imagine somebody who is an Oxford lecturer in theology who one morning discovers he has a brain tumour. Okay? The brain tumour is a pathological development. It's something that's happened inside the body. But it is going to have an adverse effect on the way in which you reason. It will impair that function. So it's going to have a significant impact which goes beyond the pathology. The pathology is you have a brain tumour, but the impairment is you do not think, you probably don't speak as well as you should. And that means it affects what you're meant to be doing. It affects your job. And that means you may end up being unemployed, and your relationship with other people may be impaired and ruptured as a result. Now again, you can see instantly how this applies to a whole range of things. For example, AIDS. AIDS is clearly about pathology, but also has major implications for participation. The key point is illness pathology? Yes, but it's much more than that. There are these different levels of a very complex reality, and they all need to be studied individually, even though they are interrelated. That's the key point I want to make here. And of course, when you start doing theology, you're looking at a whole range of things. You're looking at texts like the Bible. You're looking at religious experience. You're looking at actions. For example, remembering Christ in the Eucharist. You're talking about, the list goes on and on and on. There are so many different levels at which that simple word religion expresses itself. So you can see it's a very important way of beginning to think about things. And again, the very simple point I want to make here is that this form of critical realism really helps us begin to think not simply about reality, but how we go about doing theology. And so what I argue then is we can begin to lay out a scientific theology as having four distinct elements like this. First of all, that it's a response to reality. We are not making things up. We are trying faithfully and obediently to respond to the way things actually are, but recognizing that we are involved in the process of knowing. And that is clearly going to have an impact on the way in which we do it. We have to use things like models or analogies to be able to represent this greater reality. Secondly, it's an a posteriori discipline. You can't just say, let's just sit down and say, how are we going to investigate God? Karl Barth, I mean, I disagree with Barth on many points, but Barth makes a very important point, which actually is that God lays down the conditions on which we can interact with him. It's a very complex thing that needs to be established. Also, a scientific theology is a response to its own distinctive object. And that means that you can, for example, say that chemistry investigates its own subject in this way, physics its own subject in this way, biology its own this way, and theology its own subject in this way. It does not mean you have to use the same method for every aspect of reality. And then finally, it offers an explanation of reality. And that, I think, is important. Explanation meaning, here is how these things seem to be connected together. Here's how they seem to be related to each other. And again, if you are having an argument with an atheist, there's going to be a very significant aspect of that discussion. So we move on then, briefly, to look at the third aspect. This is the whole question of theory. And in this, I basically argue that there are very important parallels between theology and the natural sciences at the theoretical level. Let me explain what I mean. How do we go about representing reality? Now you think about that. You're a scientist. You've made some important discoveries. They seem to you to open up a new way of understanding things. How are you going to represent that? A new model, a new theory. Very often it will be a new way of understanding interactions, a new mathematical depiction of the way things are. But the key point is that there is an abstraction, the theory, the model, and then there's the empirical data, which is what generates that in the first place. Likewise with theology. And the key point I want to make is that very often you find people saying, well, of course, Christianity would do much better with our doctrines, because it'd be so much simpler, wouldn't it? But the key point is, any engagement with reality is going to generate theoretical representation. That's just the way things are. And that means that doctrines in many ways are the theological equivalent of theories. And you can argue, and again, if I had time, I'd like to talk about this, there are significant parallels between the evolution of scientific theories and the development of Christian doctrine. Just to talk about this very, very briefly, those of you who are historians of science will know that the development of scientific method has not been kind of a linear, it's been rather jerky, actually. You try this, it seems to work quite well, and at some point somebody says, no, it's not good enough. It doesn't explain things as well as this does. We need to look at some radical alternatives. The evidence, which up to that point had been okay and could be interpreted in the old way, has to be interpreted in a new way. Think, for example, of the transition from a Ptolemaic view of the world, the solar system, to the Copernican view. And again, the same thing happens in theology. Very often you find people say, we think it's this way. For example, look at the way in which Christology developed in the patristic period. People felt this way is very, very good. Then they realized, actually, it wasn't good enough. Something else has to be developed. I'll give you one very simple example. In the early church, they tended to borrow Jewish models to try and make sense of Jesus. He is some kind of prophet. We're used to that makes sense. Then they began to realize this isn't good enough to do justice to what's there. We need to consider an alternative. So the idea of the development of Christian doctrine has a very distinct parallel with the evolution of scientific theories. And obviously I'm stressing the importance of theory, but also I argue there's a real place for metaphysics in both theology and the natural sciences. Now again, you will all know that one of the most distinctive features of the 20th century philosophy of science has been an intense suspicion of metaphysics. There's what we observe. Do we need to say anything more than that? Think, for example, of protocol statements, which I'll explain in a moment. But certainly in the English language world, A.J. Ayer's very famous book, Language, Truth and Logic, was scathing about what he called metaphysical inflation. We don't need these ideas. We just look at what we can observe. And certainly that's a very important and very interesting point. And I'll come back to that in a moment, I think. But let's just look at some interesting points here before we move on. I'm going to talk about the inevitability of theory. Then I'm going to look at the problem of closure. Then I'm going to look at the redemption of particulars. Now, for some of you, this will seem like Greek, but I hope that by the end of this, it will make a lot more sense. The first one is very, very obvious. The inevitability of theory is very straightforward. For many, the simple point is we observe certain things, and there is an innate human curiosity, what Augustine calls the eros of the mind, which just says, look, there's this, there's this. What do they point to? There's a kind of intellectual curiosity that says, we can't stop there. It seems to be pointing this direction. Let's explore and see where it takes us. What big picture can we generate that explains what we can observe and predicts things we haven't yet observed? And that just seems to be part of the way we are as human beings. And again, in biology, you might think of the very famous tensions between Linnaeus and Darwin. Linnaeus, let's categorize. In other words, we observe and then we order things and we stop. And Darwin said, no, you've got to explain why. Why is there this categorization? There's something big beneath the surface. And if we just stop at categorization, we're missing out on something enormously important. And again, in the case of theology, the need to provide a public account of faith. Why do we believe in God? Again, we observe this and this and this, and we say the best way of explaining this is to talk about a God. And again, that's a very important theme in apologetics. But I want to move on now and talk about the redemption of particulars. It's an intriguing idea, and one that is very, very important and needs to be talked about a little bit. Particular simply means individual observations, evidence. Theory is the generalization from the evidence. Frank Lentricia, a very famous literary theorist, wrote an article called On Behalf of Theory. And in this he made a very interesting observation. And maybe this will resonate with you. There seems to be something about us which means that once we've generated a theory, the theory becomes triumphant. And we start to disregard the observations on which the theory is based. And in fact, more than that, we start to use the theory as a way of correcting our observations. That can't be right. So we bring observation into line with theory. And Lentricia's point was simply that there's this real danger that a theory becomes detached from the evidence on which it's actually based and actually comes to judge evidence. And Lentricia's point is that we must keep going back to the evidence and judge the theory in the light of the evidence. And again, you can see how in theology there's this constant danger of theology drifting into the intellectual stratosphere through being detached from its connection with Scripture or the life of the church. It's a real issue. And a simple example from the history of science is very illuminating here. And we look at Dalton's atomic theory. And you all know what Dalton's atomic theory is. Dalton had this brilliant idea that if you look at the relative weights of the elements, they all seem to be integral multiples of the weight of hydrogen. And Dalton began to develop the idea this might point to something very fundamental about the way in which elements were constituted. But what about chlorine? The atomic weight of chlorine is 35 and a bit, and quite a big bit actually. and that wasn't consistent with integral multiples of hydrogen. End of the theory. But it wasn't, because you all know, basically, subsequently, the discovery of isotopes came along, and people began to realize, actually, what had thought to be disconfirmation of Dalton actually was confirmation. In other words, the theory died, but the observations were there. And the key point I want to make is this: in the natural sciences and in Christian theology, the theory is subservient to what it's based on. And the real danger is you simply buy into the theory without being attentive to the original basis of that theory. That's an extremely important point to make. And again, the same issues arise in theology. I'll give you a very good example. I mean, for example, any attempt to do Christology is going to have to do justice to what is known about who Jesus is. And again, if I were to give you a lecture on historical theology, I'd make the point that there are two very simple models, both of which are inadequate, one of which stresses the humanity of Christ. Look, Jesus wept, he was hungry. He didn't know when second coming was happening. That's all indicates Jesus is a human being. And there are others saying, no, that can't be right. Jesus was divine. He just seemed to be human. That's much simpler. And the point is, both these approaches were simple, but neither of them could do justice to the whole kit and caboodle. The only way of doing that was kind of way by bringing them together into the so-called two-nature theory of Christology. Jesus is both human and divine, an incarnational way of talking about Christ. Alister McGrath, not a scientist, not a theologian, but certainly a thinker, was very, very clear on this point. And in her first novel, Under the Net, she has one of her characters say the following word: the movement away from theory and generality is the movement towards truth. All theorizing is a fight. We must be ruled by the situation itself, and this is unutterably particular. Indeed, it's something which we can never get close enough, however hard we may try, as it were, to crawl under the net. And what she's saying is, look, theory is like a net that we throw over our observation of the world. And the theory actually determines what we see. Now, you think about how you might apply that. Again, imagine you were engaged in a debate with Richard Dawkins. One of the issues might be, how do we see the world? Dawkins throws his net over it. It is the outcome of chance. There is no purpose. There is just blind, pitiless indifference. That's the way he sees it. And the theory actually has shaped the way in which he sees the world. Or you might throw over the world a different net. This is God's creation. We see signs of God's nature reflected here and there in this world. And the point Alister McGrath is making is, look, we all do this. But the key point is to go away from the theory and ask, what is this actually based on? What is the evidence for it? That seems to be an immensely important corrective some of the trends we see. One of the issues we face in any attempt to theorize is closure. Closure, in plain English, when do we get to the answer? When does the period of reflection end and you say, that's it? One of my favourite books is Austin Farrow's very good account of the book of Revelation, which he tries to look at the way in which images are used in the book of Revelation. And in this book he makes a distinction between a puzzle and a mystery. A puzzle and a mystery. Now let me offer you his clarification of this distinction and what it implies, and see if you find this helpful. A puzzle, he says, is something to which there is a definite answer. And once you've got that answer, you're there. What is the chemical formulation of water? What is the physical structure of DNA. Once you've got it, that's ended. Move on to other things, but you've sorted that out. There's closure. Pharaoh then contrasts that with a mystery. What's a mystery? For Pharaoh, a mystery is something that is rational, but is so big that we find it enormously difficult to get our minds around it. And Pharaoh's point is that we will keep on wrestling with this because we know we are never going to be able to give an exhaustive account of what this mystery is. It's not that a mystery is something irrational. It's just that our limited capacity makes it difficult for us to do justice to it. And therefore Pharaoh's point is that puzzles you solve, but mysteries you keep coming back to, and you never entirely satisfy yourself with the answers you give. Now, in this book by Hilary Lawson, Lawson argues that closure basically is our attempt to shut down otherwise promising discussions. And he argues the story of closure has been told. We never arrive at a destination, we simply pause at a temporary resting point. And while I think there's a lot wrong in what he's saying, it is actually an important point. Certainly in talking about God, we are very often saying, look, this is the best way we have of seeing things at the moment, but we may want to come back to that. But it's also true of the sciences. This is the best way of looking at things now, but we've got to keep this question open because the quest has not ended. It is ongoing. We may need to revisit this in the future, even though we believe this is the best account of things that may be given now. But Lawson then draws this, I think, rather hysterical conclusion. We are lost in the play of openness and closure. I think the point I want to make in response to this is that in the case of the natural sciences, yes, we're all aware that this may be the way we see things tomorrow, but things may change in the future. But surely what is best, what is right in today's theorizing will be carried over into tomorrow. So there's always going to be this degree of closure of saying this is the way things actually are in the future. This is Charles Gore. Charles Gore is a very interesting Anglican theologian, very active in the late 19th, early 20th century. This is from his Bampton Lectures of 1890. And what he's trying to say here is, look, mystery shouldn't be seen as a problem. It's simply recognizing that we are up against something that is really big and we struggle as we try to justice to it. Human language, he writes, never can express adequately divine realities. A constant tendency to apologize for human speech, a great element of agnosticism, an awful sense of unfathomed depths beyond the little that is made known is always present in the mind of theologians who know what they are about in conceiving or expressing God. And he then goes on and makes this point. We see, says St. Paul, in a mirror, in terms of a riddle. We know in part. And he quotes Hilary of Poitiers, we are compelled to attempt what is unattainable, to climb where we cannot reach, to speak what we cannot utter. Instead of the mere adoration of faith, we are compelled to entrust the deep things of religion to the perils of human expression. Now the point Gore is trying to make here is, look, nobody thinks that by saying, for example, God is three persons, we have solved the riddle of the Trinity. There's much more to it than that. But he's saying this is good enough for the time being, it articulates what's really important, and it leaves open other things for us to explore and to deepen our knowledge of in the future. That seems to be a very important point to make. Finally, we come to theory and metaphysics. And again, I was stressing the point that many natural scientists in the 20th century were very suspicious of metaphysics for obvious reasons. It seems to be inflationary, getting away from what can be observed in some kind of abstract, possibly surreal realm. And of course, the Vienna Circle was of enormous importance in the early 20th century at this point. And Rudolf Carnap introduced the idea of protocol statements. These are simply statements of observation. I see this. There is one for you to look at. Sorry, this is from Otto Neurath's very famous attempt to do this. Now, if you look at that, I think what you'll realize is this is a nice idea that's spiraling out of control. And that Neurath is basically saying, look, what I want people to say is he held a glass of water. But he suddenly realized that actually they're so surrounded by historical circumstance and contingency that everyone has to be identified. What he's trying to do is to say, this is what I can see, and that's it. But the key point is, you can't stop there. Because one of the questions you're going to ask is this. This is what I observe. What else must be true to account for what I do observe? In other words, is there something beyond the observable which I have to invoke to explain what can be observed? And as you probably know, Victor Lenzon's very famous critique of the Vienna Circle was that the Vienna Circle wouldn't believe in electrons. Why? Because they can't be observed. But Lenzon's point is, look, they are required. I mean, you can't make sense of things without postulating these things. And in many ways, that is what metaphysics is about. We see this and this and this, but we realize we can make an awful lot more sense of these if we postulate something else, as yet unseen or undiscovered, as in the planet Neptune perturbing the orbit of Uranus, or whatever you want to say. And in many ways, that is what Christian theology is doing. Trying to say, for example, the best way of explaining the structures of the world is to say there is a God. And if this God is like this, that makes sense of what we see and gives us a basis for rationalizing and organizing what is known. And again, the question I just deal with in the final volume is why do some theologians think you can dismiss metaphysics in advance of reflection on the evidence? So I've run out of time. I've just skimmed through some thoughts with you. The point I think you want to make is this. It seems to me science and theology are good friends. It seems to me they ought to talk to each other. And I'm so grateful more are doing this. But actually, I think that the rigor of the natural sciences has a lot to say to theologians as they try to do theology. And in this lecture, what I've tried to do is just highlight some areas where I think there's some very good basis for future discussions and future collaborations. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much indeed, Alister. That's a brilliant overview of this trilogy that you've written. So let's have some questions, please. Anyone want to start? Yes.
Yeah, I have a sort of specific theological question, really. You talked about the Barthian objection to natural theology, the fact that it sort of meant that divine revelation wasn't really required. How does that account for, say, Paul's epistles to the Romans, where he very clearly seems to indicate that there is some sort of revelation in creation and that people are without excuse because that's there, basically?
Right.
Where does that come into it?
That is the question. It's a very fair question, and Barth does offer a number of answers to that question. I have to say, I personally don't find them hugely persuasive. I mean, the point you make is very, very good. The dilemma is Barth say we go back to the Bible, but what is the Bible legitimate to natural theology? That is the real problem, and in fact, Barth is put in a very difficult position of in effect saying that there is no natural theology in the Bible. And again, if you read someone like James Barr, for example, his very good gifted lectures of a few years back, he just says, look, you cannot read the Old Testament without keeping coming across these ideas which clearly represent some kind of natural theology. Now, maybe Barth can offer some way of critiquing these, but they seem to be there. So it really is very, very difficult for Barth. And in fact, one of the major criticisms raised against Barth is that there are certain biblical passages that just do not fit his theory. And again, if we say, look, a theological theory has to be able to incorporate all these observational statements, like the Bible says this, then Barth really does some serious problems with Acts 17, Romans 1, and Psalm 19, just to give you some very obvious examples. So the obvious question then would be, well, why does Barth take this perspective then? And I think that really it's to do with his deep concern that there was a movement within certainly German language theology of his day and age, which in effect marginalized traditional resources of revelation and argued that God could be found, for example, in history, in culture, apart from the specifics of the Christian revelation. And Barth was really anxious about where that was taking him, and sometimes when the pendulum swings one way, you overcorrect the other way. And I personally would say that Barth made an important correction, but I think he pushed it further than he needed to, and that's one of the reasons why I personally have difficulty with him at that point.
Thank you. Yes. Another question? Yep.
I've actually two questions, but the first one is, why did you choose deliberately the title Scientific Theology, which has so much association with scientific socialism, which in a way attempted to do the same thing as you do with theology?
Well, yes, I did choose the title deliberately, but it wasn't really in relation to scientific socialism. I mean, in the books, for example, I'm quite critical of that tendency, particularly in sort of Marxism from about 1870 to about 1890, where I felt really it sort of lost its moorings to some extent. I chose the title really because I was trying to enter into a dialogue with a particular German tradition, which again was engaging Karl Barth, and this was to do with saying theology is, the German word is wissenschaftlich, which doesn't really mean scientific, it means it is a discipline in its own right. And in many ways what I was trying to say is it's not just wissenschaftlich, it's naturwissenschaftlich, because I was trying to emphasize that aspect of it. But I think more than that, I was really trying to say, look, the natural sciences have the potential to stimulate and inform and challenge Christian theology. And Christian theology needs to listen to outside voices and be able to say, that's a good challenge, I need to respond to that, and maybe these guys are something that can be useful in responding to me. So that's why I chose that title, to try and say I think that theology needs to be more attentive to the natural sciences. In fact, really these three volumes are not so much a work of science and religion, it's much more a work of systematic theology, which is attentive to the methods of the sciences and says we can learn from this. Your second question?
The second question is, I was a bit surprised that you sort of finished up with Carnap and the Vienna School, because they are really, in philosophical terms, rather overtaken, dismissed, forgotten by now.
Yeah.
And philosophy has really moved on a long way since then, and particularly in that one aspect that you referred to about a descriptive element, about you called it the whole discussion about epistemic and ontological gap in modern philosophy. Maybe you could say something
Yes,
more about
certainly.
that.
You're quite right. I mean, I think it's moved on very substantially since then. But sometimes memories linger. Sometimes memories linger longer outside the specific discipline in which they originated. And certainly this hostility towards metaphysics is still very prevalent in contemporary theology. Now, I mean, in contemporary philosophy, I think the Vienna Circle is nailed. I think it's been very well dealt with, and certainly in recent years there have been a very significant number of historical critical studies which have been very helpful in understanding, how this arose, the specifics of the debate, and also why it has moved on. But still, in Christian theology, there is this profound suspicion of metaphysics. And really, the point I was simply trying to make was actually we can understand why there is a suspicion. And again, you know, why the Vienna Circle arose is important. I think we can see there were real concerns about, for example, some of the metaphysical extravagances you find in, for example, some of Heidegger's writings. And I say we can understand these concerns, but nevertheless, metaphysics seems to be a significant area of thought that may need to be reformed, but certainly doesn't need to be abolished. And so, really, I was saying what I believe to be just blindingly obvious, but sometimes when I say something that's blindingly obvious and then back it up historically and theoretically, and that was what I was trying to do at that point.
Thank you. Yeah, there's one at the back. Oh, right. Someone first? Yeah, on the side. Yeah.
I would have two questions as well. The first question was related to the type of scientific theology. I confess I've only read the little book and not the big three compendiums, but as a practicing professional scientist, it's great to see the idea to get theologians to look at data with rigour and interpret it. But the problem is, once you've constructed your hypothesis, it's hard to see how you can do the experiment to check it. And so it's sort of, half of it seems valid. It's maybe more like cosmology or evolutionary biology, where you can't actually do the experiment in the lab. And how you respond to that?
Well, I think that's absolutely right, and I like the comparison with cosmology, or again with Richard Dawkins. You know, Richard Dawkins in many ways is saying, "Here's what I observe." The question is, how do I make sense of that? But I think the key point is you have observations, and the key thing is, you know, absolutely valuing those individual observations and keep coming back to them. In other words, not saying, I've got my theory, I'm going to walk away. It's always, is this really the best way of making sense of these? I've got to keep that at least partially open. And hence, in my own case, to give you a very simple example, I mean, I think Council Chalcedon's definition of Christ is right. But, there's a little bit of me says, we'll just keep this one under review. Because although I think it is right, I'm going to keep coming back to this because I need to just keep reassuring myself this is so. So I think it's this willingness to keep things under review which is so important there.
Well, the second one relates to Pascal's views of critical realism. It seems that with the different strata, you can actually end up quite quickly at Verhaagen's view that anything goes. And it's quite where that fits in with that. And so that's realism. And then the last statement which says it was good enough for the time being. Isn't that perilously close to an instrumentalist or anti-realist view, that we have a model that we use as a way of explaining things, but actually we don't have to believe what it's actually explaining is really
yes.
there?
Yes, I think that's a good point. And again, certainly one of the most intriguing things about instrumentalist approaches is that over a period of time they've got an interesting tendency of becoming realist. In other words, you begin by saying, well, I mean, you know, perhaps we can think of it as if it were like this, and that's good enough for the time being. And then, you know, 20 years later, actually, maybe it is like this. Again, you know, that tendency is really quite remarkable. So I think that one of the things I'm just trying to stress is that although we keep things under review, this doesn't mean that where we are at the moment needs to be thought of as wrong or inadequate. It may be right. But it's this principle of keeping coming back to it in case there is a better way that we have not yet conceived. And I'm not being a radical revisionist or a relativist here. I'm simply saying that there's an absolute duty to try and say, this seems to be the best way of thinking about a Trinity, whatever it is. But say, look, I've got to keep this one open because there may be something I have not yet identified which may actually be better than this. And therefore I've got to say, this is where it is at the moment, but I've got to keep this under review all the time.
But quite a lot of things that were held to be real in the scientific world are now no longer held to be real, which seems the argument of the realist position is when things move on.
Well, I think if you take someone like Ernest McMullen, for example, who addresses your point very, very well, what he will try and make is actually the fundamental conviction of a realist epistemology is that what is real will out in the end. And therefore, you know, if you've got an improper way of thinking about things, in the end, what is real will sort you out there. So it's not that you said, it's not you saying this was real and then became unreal. It's much more, we thought it was like this, but as we've become more deeply acquainted with the observations, we realised that actually it wasn't that way, it is this way, and this is what it's more like.
Yes.
In the earlier lecture, you said you hadn't had an opportunity to debate with Dawkins. I'm wondering what response there's been from theological circles to what you've been saying this afternoon, and if so, on which theological circles?
And the 3 volumes of scientific theology have been subjected to very rigorous review. And in fact, some of those reviews have been 5,000 words long, so they're going to eventually become books. I think if I could, some of them have made some very good points, and if I can just lay out the main points that I made in response. One is just that there's this general appreciation, A, this will encourage the science-religious dialogue, which is a good thing. B, this will encourage increased theological rigor, which is no bad thing, because theology has a reputation, I fear not totally undeserved, of kind of way being a little bit eclectic in its thinking. And one of the things that I was really trying to argue for was the need for greater rigor, and that in effect engaging dialogue with sciences forces you to be more rigorous, because you cannot ask, where does this come from, without having to face some very significant questions about justification, reflection, and so on. Then a number of criticisms, and I'll try and lay out the main ones. The main criticisms made are basically, number one, that it is unclear how you can make the critical judgment, here the sciences are helpful, but here they may lead us in an unhelpful direction. Now, again, one of the earlier questions made a very good point. You're saying, what about experiment? Well, actually, that's a very important point, because it is not entirely clear what the theological equivalent of experiment is. The nearest thing you're going to be able to get is reflection, or reflection on experience. But actually, there's no absolute equivalent. And of course, the critical role of experiment in scientific theorization is obvious. So the fact that there's no obvious theological equivalent to that is actually quite a significant point. In response to that, I would say, well, actually, that is true, but nevertheless, the question of how we interpret experiments is very, very important. And one of the points I make is that when you start doing theoretical reflection on experiments, one of the key questions that begin to emerge is this. Is the discrepancy between experiment and observation due to a fundamental failure in the theory, or is it due to some anomaly which will be resolved in the future? And again, that's a very important point, because how do Christians think about suffering? Is that an anomaly, or is it an issue of such fundamental magnitude that the whole idea of there being a God who is good and so on has to be abandoned? So that's an interesting line of point. So that's one area. Another criticism made particularly by Roman Catholic reviewers has been that I tend to take a rather pessimistic view of human nature. And that reflects to parts of the book where I follow Thomas Torrance, who is a Reformed theologian, and stress that there seems to be something wrong with human nature, which means that our perceptions of nature may be skewed or biased, something like that. And certainly, at least one Roman Catholic writer felt that I really had stressed far too greatly the fullness of humanity, and there was a possible correction that could be made there, which he felt was very, very appropriate. Again, I can see the force of what he's saying, and I'm very happy to review that. But for me, one of the most important theological points in dealing with our engagement with nature is what happens if, in thinking about God, it's not, if I put it like this, a pure human mind reflecting on a pure nature, but perhaps a fallen human mind reflecting on a fallen nature. Might that not lead us to make some misjudgments about the nature of God? And so that was one of the points I was making in critiquing the natural theology. And another major issue which some have raised, particularly in relation to the second volume, is whether critical realism actually is viable at all. And that's a much more general point. It is critiquing me in that I adopt a critical realism, but it is much more generally saying, is this idea of a critical realism actually sustainable? And one of the points being made there is that different writers use this phrase, critical realism, in very different ways. Doesn't that suggest actually it is an indefensible notion? There's so many definitions that suggest there's a vulnerability there. And again, I think that's an important criticism, but the word critical realism is really being used to say something like this. yes, Rodney is there, even if I leave the room. But actually, I have to recognise that in assessing what I know about Rodney, my activity as a knower has to be taken into account. And obviously there are different aspects of this. Some may stress one aspect, others different aspects. But it is this basic recognition that we are involved in constructing truth. Truth really is there, but we are interactivist in our recognition of it. And that seems to me to be the key point there. Those are just some points, but obviously there are other points as well. Time is running out, I think.
Maybe just one last one. Yeah.
It seems to me that when we have a discipline, we have both a method and a topic. I know neither what the topic nor the method of theology is. If you say it's God, I cannot understand you. I'm sorry, I had something to do with the Vienna Circle. I can't understand you.
Well, that's a very good question. And in fact, unfortunately, as Rodney was saying, this is the last question, because it actually really, this needs a very good answer, and I fear that in the time available I'm not going to be able to give it. But let me try and give an answer. I mean, in one sense, you look at the etymology. Theology is discourse about God. But actually, I mean, where is God? I mean, for example, I could give you a very good lecture on this, because I can, show it to me. We can discuss its shape, its size, anything like that. God is rather more complex. And therefore, one of the reasons why I like Roy Bhaskar is he says, look, it's like illness is about this and this and this and this. Therefore, we're going to talk about God at a number of different levels, looking perhaps at the way in which God impacts on, for example, me, on the Christian community, on the world, the texts in which people talk about God, the ways in which people celebrate God, for example, worship and so on. And so in many ways, theology is probably better thought of not so much as thinking about God, but rather about trying to make sense of the way the world is, with God being an integral part of that. But there are also other landmarks along the way. For example, who is Jesus? Who am I? What is the world here for? And so on. So it is a big picture of reality. And in many ways, I think Christian theology is best thought of as a way of trying to make sense of the way things are from the perspective of the Christian tradition. And so therefore it involves a rigorous analysis of both what Christians actually think, but also, I think your point here is very, very good, why they think that at all. So if you like, it is a rigorous but critical examination, not just of the ideas Christians have, but also why they have those ideas in the first place. It doesn't mean they're right. I want to stress that. Now, I personally do think they are, but it's much more this willingness to be critical about where these ideas come from. What is the best way of construing and expressing them? And then what sort of way of looking at things do they make possible? And again, if I just end...
So is this religion as a natural phenomenon? We're trying to understand why it's there, what it is?
Well, I think, again, that's an extremely important point, because one of the questions that any worldview has to explain, and certainly Christianity has to explain this as well, is why is there this thing called religion? Why does it seem so natural? I think it's an extremely important point that has to be part of the agenda we're trying to explain.